You have 72 hours to dismantle that monstrosity, or the homeowners association will dismantle it for you and bill you for the demolition, plus a $5,000 fine for gross negligence and endangerment. That was the first sentence Carol ever spoke to me. Not, hello, not, welcome to the neighborhood, but a declaration of war delivered from my own front porch. She stood there, a woman built like a filing cabinet, clutching a clipboard to her chest as if it were a holy text. I had moved into Maple Creek Estates 3 months prior, seeking refuge. The world had gone quiet for me after my wife, Sarah, passed away. The silence in our old house was a physical weight, pressing down on me and our 2 kids, 10-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Sam. We needed a new start, a place where the memories weren't baked into the walls. Maple Creek, with its identical, perfectly manicured lawns and promises of a safe, family-friendly community, seemed like the answer. A blank slate. I was a structural engineer. My entire life was about calculating loads, understanding stress points, and building things that would outlast the people who made them. It was a profession of certainty in an uncertain world. After Sarah's illness, I craved that certainty more than ever. The logic of steel and concrete was a comfort when human biology had proven so brutally illogical. Part of the dream Sarah and I had for our kids was a treehouse. Not some slapped-together pallet in the branches, but a real one. A fortress of childhood, a place for whispered secrets and summer afternoons. After we moved, I saw the perfect tree in our new backyard, a massive, ancient oak whose branches seemed to reach out like welcoming arms. Building the treehouse became my therapy. It was a project I could pour my grief into, transforming it into something joyful for my children. I didn't just build a treehouse, I engineered one. I spent 2 weeks on the designs alone, running simulations on my computer for wind shear and load distribution. I used galvanized steel brackets that were rated for 5 times the weight I ever expected the structure to hold. The foundation wasn't just bolted to the tree, it was supported by 2 concrete piers I poured myself, sunk 4 feet into the ground to bypass the frost line. I submitted the plans to the city, pulled the necessary permits, and had every stage of the construction inspected and signed off on. The city inspector, a gruff old man named Miller, had actually whistled when he saw the final product. "Son," he'd said, shaking his head with a grin, "you could park a pickup truck in this thing." The kids were ecstatic. It was the first time I'd seen genuine, unadulterated joy on their faces in almost a year. Their laughter echoing from the small wooden structure in the oak tree was the sound of our family starting to heal. And then Carol arrived. I looked from her stern, unforgiving face to the treehouse, then back again. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice calm. "Who are you?" Her lips thinned into a razor slash. "I am Carol Jenkins, president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association. A fact you would know if you bothered to read your welcome packet or attend the monthly meetings. I've been a bit busy," I said, gesturing vaguely toward my house, where 2 small children were still trying to navigate a world without their mother. "This is about the treehouse." "The monstrosity," she corrected. "It is an unapproved, unsafe, and aesthetically disastrous structure. It violates Section C, Paragraph 4 of the Community Bylaws regarding exterior modifications." I had, in fact, read the bylaws. All 128 pages of them. It was the engineer in me. I needed to know the rules of the system I was in. Section C, Paragraph 4, I recited from memory, pertains to sheds, gazebos, and other ground-level auxiliary structures. It says nothing about treehouses. Furthermore, the structure is fully permitted and has passed all city safety inspections. I have the paperwork right here. I made a move to go inside and get the file, but she held up a hand, a fleshy stop sign. "City permits are irrelevant," she snapped, the words sharp and clipped. "The HOA has its own, higher standards. We are not bound by municipal bureaucracy. The Architectural Review Committee has deemed it unsafe. It must come down." "The Architectural Review Committee?" I asked. "Who's on that?" A flicker of smugness crossed her face. "Myself, my husband, and Mr. Henderson from 3 doors down." "Of course." A committee of 3, 2 of whom shared a bed. It was a tin-pot dictatorship disguised as a community board. I felt a familiar weariness settle over me. This was the kind of arbitrary, power-drunk nonsense I had no energy for. All I wanted was to be left alone to raise my kids. Look, Carol, I said, trying to keep my tone reasonable. I'm a structural engineer. This treehouse is probably the safest structure on this entire block, including your house. My kids love it. It's not going anywhere. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, furious slits. The conversational part of our encounter was clearly over. You are new here, so I will give you this one and only warning. You are in violation. The fines will begin in 72 hours. They are $500 a day. They will accrue. We will put a lien on your property. We will foreclose. We have done it before. The threat hung in the air, thick and acrid. It was so disproportionate, so utterly insane, that for a moment I could only stare at her. She wasn't just a busybody, she was a predator who had mistaken my quiet grief for weakness. Is that all? I asked, my voice now colder than I intended. She gave a sharp, satisfied nod, as if she had just won a major battle. She turned on her heel and marched down my walkway, her back ramrod straight. I stood there for a long moment, the screen door humming softly. I could hear Lily and Sam laughing in the backyard. The sound was everything. It was the reason I got up in the morning, the reason I fought through the fog of loss. This woman, this petty tyrant with her clipboard and her imaginary authority, had just threatened the first piece of happiness my children had found in a year. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I wasn't just a grieving father. I was a man who understood pressure points, leverage, and the precise amount of force required to make a flawed structure collapse entirely. And Carol's little empire, I suspected, was built on a foundation of cheap concrete and rotten wood. The escalation began subtly, like a slow-acting poison. 3 days after her visit, a crisp white envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was the first fine, $500, for unapproved auxiliary structure. I scanned it, filed it in a new folder labeled HOA nonsense, and went about my day. Another arrived the next day. And the next. They were as regular as the sunrise. Then came the ancillary attacks. A notice for my grass being 1/4 of an inch too high. A violation for a garden hose being visible from the street for more than 12 hours. A warning that the paint color on my front door, the same color it was when I bought the house, was not on the pre-approved palette and would need to be repainted within 30 days. Each notice was a paper cut. Annoying, stinging, but ultimately insignificant on its own. But I knew this was a war of attrition. She was trying to bury me in paperwork, to bleed me dry with petty fines until compliance became the easier path. She was banking on me being too tired, too overwhelmed with single fatherhood and my own grief, to fight back. I started documenting everything. I bought a dedicated hard drive and a scanner. Every notice, every fine was scanned, dated, and saved. I set up a spreadsheet to track the violations and the absurd amounts she was charging. I started carrying a small digital recorder in my pocket whenever I left the house. My interactions with her were brief and always in public. She'd see me getting my mail and march over to remind me that my fines were accumulating. "Mr. Harrison," she'd say, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "your outstanding balance is now $3,000. We expect prompt payment." "Noted, Carol," I'd reply calmly, tapping the recorder in my pocket. "Have a lovely day." My refusal to engage, to argue, or get angry, seemed to fuel her rage more than any confrontation could have. It was like she was throwing rocks at a brick wall and was furious that the wall wasn't screaming in pain. She began posting passive-aggressive screeds on the community's official social media page. Long posts about the importance of maintaining community standards and the dangers of unpermitted construction, always accompanied by a stock photo of a collapsed deck or a leaning shed. She never used my name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. A few neighbors offered me sympathetic looks when I saw them, a quick, furtive nod of solidarity, but no one dared speak up. They were all living under the same thumb. The community was her playground, and she ruled it through fear. I learned from a neighbor, a timid man named George who spoke to me in hushed tones while pretending to inspect his azaleas, that Carol had been president for 10 years. She had forced out a family 2 years ago over the color of their window shutters, burying them in legal fees until they had to sell. She had a network of sycophants who reported every minor infraction, creating a neighborhood-wide surveillance state. My initial plan was simple: defense. I compiled a thick binder containing my treehouse blueprints, the structural analysis reports, copies of the city permits, the inspection certificates, and a printout of the relevant HOA bylaws with the key phrases highlighted. I was preparing for a legal battle, assuming reason and law would prevail. I was still operating under the assumption that the system was flawed, but fundamentally rational. That assumption was shattered on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was in my home office, on a conference call, when I heard my daughter Lily let out a terrified scream from the backyard. It wasn't the sound of a scraped knee or a sibling squabble. It was a raw, primal cry of fear. I dropped the phone and sprinted through the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. I burst through the back door and saw it. Carol was standing at the base of the oak tree, one hand on the ladder, her face twisted in a mask of fury. Lily was halfway up the ladder, frozen, while Sam was peering down from the treehouse deck, his face pale. "You get down from there this instant." Carol was shrieking, her voice a shrill weapon. "This death trap is going to collapse and kill you. Your father doesn't care about your safety. He's a negligent, selfish man." My vision went red. The patient, methodical engineer vanished, replaced by a father whose children were being threatened. I crossed the lawn in 5 long strides. "Carol," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Get away from my children." She whirled around, momentarily surprised by my sudden appearance. "I am trying to save them from your incompetence," she spat. "This thing is a lawsuit waiting to happen." "The only danger here is you," I said, moving to stand between her and the ladder. I looked up at Lily, whose face was streaked with tears. "It's okay, sweetie. Come on down. You too, Sam." They scrambled down the ladder and ran to me, burying their faces in my legs. I wrapped my arms around them, my entire body trembling with a protective rage I hadn't felt in years. I turned my full attention back to Carol. "You will never speak to my children again. You will not come onto my property again. You will not threaten or harass my family again. Do you understand me?" She took a step back, her bravado faltering for a second in the face of my cold fury. But the tyrant in her reasserted itself. "This is my community. I have a right to ensure its safety. I will be calling Child Protective Services. They'll be very interested to hear about the dangerous environment you're forcing these poor children to live in." And that was it. The turning point. The line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. She had threatened to bring the power of the state into my home, to use my children as weapons in her pathetic little war over a treehouse. The game was no longer about defense. It was about eradication. "Get off my property, Carol," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Now." She held my gaze for a moment, then seemed to realize she had pushed too far. She gave a haughty sniff, turned, and marched away, but the damage was done. I held my kids until their sobbing subsided. I took them inside, made them hot chocolate, and put on their favorite movie. But as I sat there with them, stroking their hair, my mind was already at work. The binder of permits and bylaws on my desk seemed laughably naive. This wasn't a legal dispute to be won with evidence and reason. This was a war against an irrational, malignant force. And you don't reason with a malignancy. You cut it out. That night, after the kids were asleep, I went to my office and opened a new file on my computer. I labeled it Project Chimera, the mythical beast made of disparate parts. It felt appropriate. My plan would have legal, technical, and psychological components. It would be a multi-front war. Phase 1 was information. I needed to know everything about Carol Jenkins. Not the HOA president, but the woman. I started with public records. Property deeds, tax assessments, court records. It was tedious work, but my engineering background had trained me for meticulous data collection. I discovered a few interesting tidbits. She and her husband had purchased their house 15 years ago with a very small down payment. Her husband, Frank, owned a small, perpetually struggling construction company called Jenkins & Sons Contracting. I found it odd that the son was plural, as public records showed they had only one son, a man in his late 20s named Kevin. Next, I dove into the HOA's own records. As a homeowner, I was entitled to review their financial statements and meeting minutes. I sent a certified letter requesting copies of the last 5 years of financial documents, citing the relevant state statute. The bylaws required them to comply within 10 business days. While I waited for that, I moved to Phase 2, surveillance. I ordered 4 high-resolution, weatherproof security cameras online. They were small, discreet, and had excellent night vision. I spent a weekend installing them. One was positioned under the eaves of my roof, giving a clear, wide-angle view of my entire front yard and the street. Another was hidden in a birdhouse, aimed directly at the treehouse. The third I placed in a window overlooking my driveway. The last one was a small nanny cam that I placed on my front porch, disguised as a decorative rock. Everything was recorded to a secure server in my basement. The third phase was social. I needed to break through the wall of fear Carol had built around the neighborhood. I started taking walks in the evening, waving to everyone. I offered to help the timid George with his sprinkler system. I complimented another neighbor on her rose bushes. I made small talk, never mentioning the HOA or Carol. I just made myself a visible, friendly, and normal part of the community. I wanted them to see me not as the violator Carol painted me as, but as a widowed father trying to make a life for his kids. 10 days after my request, a thick manila envelope arrived. The HOA's financial records. I spread them out on my dining room table, along with a pot of coffee, and got to work. For the first 2 hours, it was exactly what I expected: records of dues collected, payments for landscaping, insurance, utilities. It was boring, which is what it was supposed to be. But then I got to the vendor payments. And I saw the name. Jenkins and Sons Contracting. It appeared again. And again. And again. The HOA had paid Carol's husband's company hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last 5 years. There were invoices for clubhouse roof repair, community fence repainting, pool pump maintenance, and annual sidewalk pressure washing. My heart started beating a little faster. This was it. The weakness. It wasn't just hypocrisy, it was a massive conflict of interest, and likely, fraud. I spent the next 2 days cross-referencing everything. I pulled the city permits for the clubhouse roof repair. The permit was filed, but the final inspection was never completed. It was left open. That was a huge red flag. It meant the work was either not done to code or not done at all. I took a walk past the community pool. The pump was making a horrible grinding noise, a sound I recognized as a bearing about to fail. The invoice from Jenkins and Sons claimed it had been fully serviced 3 months ago for $6,000. I knew a new commercial-grade pump cost about $4,000. A service shouldn't have been more than a few hundred. The sidewalks were a patchwork of clean and dirty spots, as if the pressure washing had been done by a teenager in a hurry. The fence was peeling. It was a classic scheme. Carol, as HOA president, approved bloated, overpriced contracts for her husband's company, which then performed shoddy or incomplete work. They were using the residents' dues as their personal slush fund. The treehouse wasn't the issue. My defiance was. I was the homeowner who might actually read the financials, who might ask questions. I was a threat to their entire grift. This changed everything. My quiet war of attrition was over. I was now on a hunt, and I had the scent of a much larger animal. The false CPS report she had threatened me with was no longer just a cruel jab, it was the desperate act of a cornered criminal trying to eliminate a threat. I needed to set a trap. A carefully calibrated, precisely engineered trap that would make her incriminate herself in a way that was undeniable. My plan began to crystallize, taking shape in my mind like one of my blueprints. It needed to be elegant in its simplicity, relying on her own predictable patterns of behavior. Her arrogance was her greatest weakness. Her belief that she was untouchable was the flaw in her foundation. I was going to apply just enough pressure to that single point until the whole rotten structure came crashing down. I decided to use the treehouse itself as bait. I went to a specialty hardware store and bought a set of high-tensile, tamper-evident security bolts. They were expensive, but they had a unique feature. The head of the bolt was designed to shear off if anyone tried to loosen it with a wrench, leaving a smooth, flush surface. It was a visual, permanent record of tampering. I spent an afternoon replacing a dozen of the main structural bolts on the treehouse with these new ones. I made sure they were in highly visible locations. Then, I drafted a letter. It was addressed to the HOA Board of Directors, care of Carol Jenkins. In it, I formally contested all of the fines levied against me. I stated that the treehouse was a legally permitted and professionally engineered structure. And then came the bait. I wrote, to allay any good faith concerns the committee may have about the structural integrity, I have recently upgraded the primary fasteners to state-of-the-art, tamper-evident bolts. Any unauthorized attempt to inspect or alter these bolts will be immediately apparent and will be treated as criminal trespassing and vandalism. I sent the letter via certified mail. I knew how she would read it. She wouldn't see it as a safety measure. She would see it as a challenge. A gauntlet thrown down. I was daring her, and her ego wouldn't allow her to ignore it. She would have to prove me wrong. She would have to prove the structure was unsafe, and now I had made it impossible for her to do so without leaving evidence. I waited. The daily fines stopped arriving in my mailbox. An eerie silence descended. It was the calm before the storm. I checked my camera feeds every morning and every night. For a week, nothing happened. I started to wonder if I had miscalculated, if she was smarter than I gave her credit for. Then, on a moonless Thursday night, my gamble paid off. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the birdhouse camera. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I pulled up the live feed on my phone. The infrared camera cast the backyard in a ghostly black and white. Two figures were creeping across my lawn, moving toward the oak tree. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by hoodies. One of them was bulky, a man's build. The other was smaller. They carried a toolbox and a long crowbar. They reached the tree, and the larger figure began to climb the ladder, a heavy wrench in his hand. I recognized the swagger, the build. It was her husband, Frank. The second figure, standing guard at the bottom, was almost certainly their son, Kevin. I didn't call the police. Not yet. That would be too simple, too clean. This needed to play out. I watched, my breath held, as Frank reached the main deck of the treehouse. He put his wrench on one of my new tamper-evident bolts and began to heave. I could see the strain in his shoulders. There was a faint ping sound, audible even on the camera's microphone. The bolt head sheared off, just as designed. He stared at it, confused, then moved to another. Ping. And another. Ping. He was mutilating my property, trying to sabotage it to create the unsafe condition Carol had been screeching about. And he was doing it on high-definition video. After failing to loosen any of the critical bolts, he grew frustrated. He took the crowbar and began prying at the deck boards, managing to splinter one of them. Kevin, from the ground, hissed something at him, and they seemed to argue in whispers. Finally, they gave up. They gathered their tools and scurried away into the darkness. I saved the video file to 3 separate locations, including a cloud server. I had them. Trespassing, attempted vandalism, conspiracy. This was no longer an HOA dispute. This was a criminal matter. The next monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. It was usually a sparsely attended affair, held in the community clubhouse, where Carol would pontificate to a handful of retirees about lawn maintenance. This time, I planned to make it a must-see event. I spent the weekend preparing. I edited the security footage into a short, devastating clip. I printed out large, poster-sized copies of the most damning invoices from Jenkins and Sons Contracting. I prepared a calm, factual, 5-minute speech. On Monday, I took a walk and ran into George, my timid neighbor. "George," I said, my voice low and confidential. "You might want to come to the HOA meeting tomorrow night. I think it's going to be educational." The look in my eyes must have conveyed the gravity. He just nodded, his own eyes wide. I had similar conversations with 2 other neighbors I had been friendly with. I was planting seeds, building an audience. Tuesday evening, I walked into the clubhouse. The room was buzzing. My little word-of-mouth campaign had worked. Instead of the usual 6 or 7 attendees, there were at least 30 people there, lining the walls and filling every chair. Carol was at the front of the room, behind a folding table, flanked by her husband Frank and the perpetually silent Mr. Henderson. She looked surprised by the turnout, but a pleased, self-important smile was plastered on her face. She thought they were there for her. She droned on with the usual business, the treasurer's report, the landscaping committee update. Then she arrived at new business, her eyes scanned the room and landed on me. The smile tightened. Finally, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, we must address the ongoing safety violation at Lot 42. Mr. Harrison has continued to defy the board's directives regarding his unapproved and dangerous structure. The daily fines now total. She consulted her clipboard, $17,500. The board has voted to place a lien on his property and begin foreclosure proceedings. A gasp went through the room. This was the public execution she had wanted. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising with theatrical fervor, we have received an independent assessment. A professional contractor has determined that the structure is, and I quote, critically unstable and at imminent risk of collapse. For the safety of the children, we have no choice but to act. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then I stood up. Carol, I have a question about that independent assessment, I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the quiet room. You are out of order, Mr. Harrison, she snapped. Was the professional contractor you hired, by any chance, Jenkins and Sons Contracting? I asked. Frank, her husband, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Carol's face paled slightly. The board is not required to disclose its vendors, she said evasively. I see, I said. Well, perhaps this will refresh your memory. I walked to the front of the room and turned on the large television monitor that was used for community presentations. I had plugged in my laptop before the meeting started. I hit play. The grainy, night vision footage filled the screen. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner. They watched as two shadowy figures crept onto my property. They watched as Frank Jenkins put a wrench on my bolts. They heard the distinct ping as the tamper-evident heads sheared off. They saw him take a crowbar to my children's playhouse. The collective gasp in the room was sharp and loud. People were turning to stare at Frank, whose face had gone the color of ash. Carol was frozen, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with disbelief and panic. I paused the video on a clear shot of Frank's face, illuminated for a moment by his own flashlight. This assessment took place last Thursday at 2:17 a.m., I said calmly. I believe the legal term for this is trespassing, attempted destruction of property, and manufacturing false evidence. I have the full, unedited video, which I will be turning over to the police in the morning. All hell broke loose. People were shouting. George was on his feet, pointing a trembling finger at Carol. You lied to us. You've been lying about everything. Carol slammed her hand on the table. This is an illegal recording. It's doctored. He's trying to intimidate me because he can't follow simple rules, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. She was losing control, and the entire neighborhood was watching her unravel. She turned her fury on me. You are finished in this community, Harrison. I will sue you for everything you have. I will see you in jail for this illegal surveillance. I will see your children taken away from you. But her threats were hollow now. The spell was broken. The neighbors weren't looking at her with fear anymore, they were looking at her with contempt. She had lost her audience, lost her credibility, lost her power, all in the space of a 2-minute video clip. I held up my hand for quiet. That's not all, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I switched the input on the TV to a different file. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. This, I announced, is a summary of the HOA's payments to Jenkins and Sons Contracting over the last 5 years. Over $400,000 of our dues have been paid to the president's husband's company. For work like this. I clicked through a slideshow of pictures I had taken. The peeling fence. The spotty sidewalks. The close-up of the ancient, corroded pool pump that had supposedly been serviced for $6,000. For the finale, I displayed a copy of the city permit for the clubhouse roof, the words, final inspection, pending, circled in red. We are sitting under a roof that was never certified as safe by the city, but for which we paid Jenkins and Sons $75,000, I said, letting the words sink in. The room was deathly quiet now. The anger had been replaced by a cold, dawning horror as everyone realized the extent of the betrayal. They had been robbed, systematically, for years, by the very person who lectured them about the color of their mailboxes. Carol was breathing in ragged gasps, her face a mottled red and white. She looked from the screen to the faces of her neighbors, and for the first time, she seemed to understand that she was utterly, irrevocably ruined. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just made a strange, strangled sound. She had dug her own grave, shovelful by shovelful, with every petty fine and every condescending remark. I had simply provided the mirror for her to see it. The first phase of Project Chimera was complete. The beast was wounded and exposed. Now it was time to finish it. The aftermath of that meeting was like a dam breaking. The fear that had held the neighborhood in a state of paralysis for years was gone, replaced by a torrent of righteous anger. People I'd never spoken to stopped me on the street to shake my hand, to thank me, to share their own horror stories about Carol. It turned out almost everyone had a tale of her bullying and abuse of power. They had just been too scared to speak up alone. Now, they had a voice. But I knew Carol wouldn't go down without a fight. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. Her public humiliation would only fuel a more vicious, desperate retaliation. I braced myself. The war was about to move from the community clubhouse to a much darker, more personal battlefield. It started 2 days later. An anonymous letter appeared in every mailbox on the street. It was a poorly written, rambling diatribe printed on cheap copy paper. It called me a dangerous deviant who was illegally spying on his neighbors. It hinted that my security cameras were pointed into people's windows. The most vile part was the insinuation about why a single man would build such an elaborate fortress for children. It didn't say the word, but the implication was clear and utterly sickening. I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach as I read it. This was a new level of depravity. She wasn't just attacking me anymore, she was trying to brand me as a monster in the eyes of the very people who had just started to trust me. My first instinct was to storm over to her house, to confront her, but I stopped myself. That's what she wanted. She wanted me to lose my cool, to look like the unhinged person she was painting me as. Instead, I calmly collected the letter from my mailbox, put it in an evidence bag, and scanned it. I then went for a walk. When I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, reading her copy with a look of disgust, I approached her. "Morning, Eleanor," I said gently. "Got one of those, too, I see." She looked up, her face full of sympathy. "John, this is despicable. No one believes this filth. We all know where it came from." She crumpled the paper in her fist. "After what you showed us at the meeting, we see her for what she is." It was a small comfort, but a significant one. Her smear campaign was backfiring. Her credibility was so shot that even her most poisonous lies couldn't find purchase. But she wasn't done. The next day, 2 smartly dressed caseworkers from Child Protective Services were at my door. My blood ran cold. She had actually done it. She had made the call. "Mr. Harrison," the woman asked, her expression professionally neutral. "We've received an anonymous report of child endangerment at this address. May we come in?" I forced myself to remain calm, to breathe. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "Please, come in. My children are at school right now." For the next 2 hours, they went through my house. They inspected my kitchen, the kids' bedrooms, the state of the bathrooms. They asked me a battery of questions about my life, my work, my relationship with my children, about Sarah's passing. It was invasive, humiliating, and terrifying. The entire time, I could feel my life, my family, hanging by a thread, all because of the vindictive whim of a petty tyrant. Finally, they asked to see the source of the complaint, the treehouse. I led them into the backyard. They stood at the base of the oak, looking up at the structure. The male caseworker, a man with tired eyes, walked around it, examining the support piers, the steel brackets, the thick decking. "This is the dangerous structure?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Yes," I said. "I'm a structural engineer. I designed and built it myself. It's fully permitted and passed all city inspections. I have the paperwork." I handed him the binder. He flipped through it, his eyebrows rising. He looked at his partner. "It's got more documentation than my house," he muttered. He then looked up at me. "Mr. Harrison, anonymous calls like this are often malicious. They're used as a weapon in neighborly disputes. Based on what we've seen here, a clean home, a well-stocked pantry, and what appears to be the safest treehouse in the history of mankind, we won't be taking this any further. But the case will have to remain open for 30 days, as per protocol. We'll be in touch. Relief washed over me so intensely I felt dizzy. They left, and I sank onto my porch steps, my head in my hands. She had tried to take my children. The last, most precious part of my world. That was the final piece of motivation I needed. My methodical plan for exposure was no longer enough. I didn't just want her removed from power. I wanted her to face real, tangible consequences. I wanted justice. The universe, it seems, agreed with me. That evening, my doorbell rang. It was George, my timid neighbor. He looked even more nervous than usual, clutching a plain brown envelope in his hand. "John," he whispered, casting furtive glances down the street. I can't stay quiet anymore. My wife, she's the HOA treasurer. Carol bullies her, makes her sign things. She's been a nervous wreck for years. My focus sharpened. This was it. The whistleblower. After that meeting, he continued, his voice trembling, and after those disgusting letters, my wife decided she's had enough. She couldn't sleep. She asked me to give this to you. She said you would know what to do with it. He thrust the envelope into my hands. Don't tell anyone where you got it. Please. We're scared of what Carol might do. I won't, George. I promise, I said, my voice filled with gratitude. Thank you. Tell your wife thank you. He scurried away, and I went back inside, my hand shaking slightly as I opened the envelope. It was the smoking gun. Inside were copies of bank statements, checks, and internal emails. It was all there, in black and white. Proof of embezzlement, clear as day. Checks written from the HOA account to Jenkins and Sons for services, which were then deposited and transferred to Carol's personal savings account the very next day. Emails from Carol to George's wife, pressuring her to approve payments without proper invoices. A bid from a reputable roofing company for the clubhouse for $40,000, almost half of what she paid her husband. And next to it, a handwritten note in the margin from Carol, decline. Using our vendor. She wasn't just giving her husband inflated contracts, she was laundering the money directly into her own pocket. This wasn't a civil matter of breaking bylaws anymore. This was wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. These were felonies. The next morning, I did not call the local police. I had a feeling Carol had friends in low places, and I didn't want this getting buried or tipped off. Instead, I called the state's Attorney General's office, the Economic Crimes Division. I spent an hour on the phone with a very serious, very interested investigator named Detective Miller. I laid out the entire story, from the first find to the envelope George had given me. I told him about the video, the financial records, the false CPS report. He was silent for a long time after I finished. "Mr. Harrison," he finally said, "it sounds like you've done most of our work for us. Would it be possible for you to come to our downtown office this afternoon with everything you have?" That afternoon, I sat in a sterile, windowless room with Detective Miller and a state prosecutor. I handed over my evidence, the binder, the hard drive with the video, the spreadsheet analysis, and the contents of George's envelope. They looked through it all, their expressions growing grimmer with each page. "The false report to CPS is a Class A misdemeanor," the prosecutor said, tapping a pen on the table. "The trespassing and vandalism are also misdemeanors. But this," she said, holding up the bank statements, "this is grand larceny and fraud. These are serious felonies. We're talking years in prison." We spent the next 2 hours devising a plan. A public takedown wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was strategic. We wanted her to feel secure, to walk into a situation where she believed she was in complete control, right before the floor fell out from under her. We decided to use her own favorite weapon against her, an emergency HOA meeting. I would use the bylaws to call one, citing the need to address the community's serious financial and legal liabilities. We knew her ego wouldn't let her refuse. It would be her stage, her chance to discredit me once and for all. She would have no idea that the audience would include plainclothes officers from the state's highest law enforcement agency. The final showdown was set. The clubhouse, the site of her initial humiliation, would now be the stage for her complete and utter downfall. I felt a cold, clean sense of purpose settle over me. This was the final calculation in a long and complex equation. And the result, I knew, would be justice. The notice for the emergency meeting went out, and the effect on the neighborhood was electric. The buzz was palpable. Everyone knew this was it, the final act of the drama that had gripped Maple Creek Estates. Carol, true to form, tried to seize control of the narrative. She sent out her own email blast, framing the meeting as her initiative. "Join your HOA president," it read, "as we confront the malicious lies and slander that have threatened our peaceful community. We will present the unvarnished truth and take decisive action to protect our property values and our way of life." It was a masterpiece of self-righteous delusion. She was walking into her own execution, convinced she was the guest of honor. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. People were standing in the back, peering through the windows. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. I saw George and his wife in the front row. She gave me a small, terrified, but resolute nod. I nodded back. I arrived with my laptop and a small projector. Carol was already at the front table, flanked by her husband Frank. She was dressed in a severe navy blue pantsuit, her face set like concrete. When she saw me, a triumphant smirk played on her lips. She thought I was a lamb to the slaughter. Detective Miller and 2 other plainclothes officers were already in the room, seated separately in the back, looking for all the world like concerned homeowners. Carol banged a gavel on the table. "This emergency meeting of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice booming with false authority. "The sole item on the agenda is the conduct of Mr. John Harrison and the threat he poses to this community." She launched into a prepared speech, a tirade of lies and half-truths. She painted me as a disgruntled rule-breaker who had concocted a bizarre conspiracy theory to avoid paying his fines. She called the video of her husband a deep-fake fabrication, and the financial documents forgeries. "This man," she declared, pointing a finger at me, "is a cancer on our community. He has spied on us, slandered us, and tried to turn neighbor against neighbor. But tonight, the truth comes out. Tonight, the board will vote on his immediate and permanent expulsion from this community, and we will pursue every legal avenue to recover the damages he has caused." She finished to a smattering of applause from a few of her known cronies. The rest of the room was silent, watching me, waiting. Carol gestured magnanimously in my direction. "The board, in its infinite fairness, will allow the accused to speak for 5 minutes before we vote. Say your piece, Mr. Harrison. It will be your last chance." I walked calmly to the front of the room and set up my projector. I didn't look at her. I addressed the room, my neighbors. "I don't need 5 minutes," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still room. "The truth doesn't require long speeches." I projected the first image onto the screen behind Carol's head. It was a copy of the check for $75,000 from the HOA to Jenkins and Sons for the clubhouse roof. "This is our money," I said simply. I clicked to the next slide. It was the $40,000 bid from the legitimate roofing company. "This is what it should have cost." Next slide. A bank statement showing the $75,000 deposit into the Jenkins and Sons business account. Next slide. A transfer record showing $70,000 moving from the business account to Carol Jenkins' personal savings account 2 days later. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Carol twisted in her chair to look at the screen. The color drained from her face. "This is called embezzlement," I said, my voice still level. "It's a felony." I kept clicking. A check for $6,000 for pool pump service. A transfer of $5,000 to Carol's account. An invoice for $10,000 for fence painting. A transfer of $8,000 to a personal investment account. Slide after slide, the evidence built, undeniable and damning. It was the story of her greed, written in the cold, hard language of bank records. With each click, her composure crumbled. Her face went from shock to denial to pure, animal rage. "Lies. These are forgeries," she screamed, lunging to her feet. "He's a hacker. He's a criminal." "The state attorney general's office authenticated these records this afternoon, Carol," I said, my voice finally taking on an edge of steel. They were very interested. They were also very interested in the false report you filed with Child Protective Services. They call that interference with child custody, and it's also a crime. Frank, her husband, looked like he was about to faint. He was staring at the screen, then at his wife, the dim realization of their shared ruin dawning in his eyes. Carol completely lost it. The mask of the calm, authoritative president shattered, revealing the hysterical, cornered criminal beneath. You did this, she shrieked at me, her finger shaking. You pathetic little man. You came into my community and you ruined everything. I will destroy you. I will burn your house down. I will see your children in an orphanage. Her confession, screamed in a room full of witnesses, was the final nail in her coffin. As if on cue, Detective Miller stood up from the back of the room. Carol Jenkins, he said, his voice calm but powerful, cutting through her tirade. I'm a detective with the Attorney General's office. You're under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His two partners stood up as well, converging on the front table. The room was in stunned silence. Carol stared at him, her mind unable to process what was happening. You can't arrest me, she stammered. I'm the president. Not anymore, Miller said as one of the other officers took her arm. She tried to pull away, and they efficiently snapped a pair of handcuffs on her wrists. The click of the metal echoed in the silent room. The reality of the situation finally hit her. She collapsed into a sobbing, screaming mess. Frank! Do something, she wailed at her husband. Frank just sat there, looking at his cuffed wife, his face a slack mask of defeat. Detective Miller looked at him. Frank Jenkins, you're under arrest as well. For the same. As they were led out of the clubhouse, past the shocked faces of the neighbors they had lorded over and stolen from for years, Carol locked eyes with me. Her face was a mess of tears and rage. You'll regret this, Harrison, she spat, her voice a venomous hiss. This isn't over. But it was. Her threat was impotent, the last gasp of a tyrant who had just lost her kingdom. I watched them being put into the back of an unmarked car, the red and blue lights flashing silently in the twilight. A quiet satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't triumph or revenge. It was the feeling of a complex problem solved, of a flawed structure safely and permanently dismantled. In the weeks that followed, Maple Creek Estates underwent a quiet revolution. An interim board was elected, with George's wife, a newfound hero, unanimously voted in as the new treasurer. Their first official act was to hold a bonfire, where they ceremoniously burned the old book of bylaws. All of my fines were voided, and the board issued a formal, public apology to my family. The story of Carol's downfall became a local legend. The trial was a formality. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had compiled, she and her husband both took plea deals. Carol was sentenced to 7 years in state prison for embezzlement. Frank got 3 years for his role. They were forced to pay back every cent they had stolen, which meant selling their house and liquidating their assets. They lost everything. Their reign was over, their names reduced to a cautionary tale. The community began to heal. The atmosphere of fear was replaced by one of cooperation. Neighbors started talking to each other again. A new set of simpler, common-sense rules were drafted. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community building. My life returned to a quiet rhythm. The peace I had so desperately sought when I first moved here finally became a reality. I was no longer the neighborhood pariah, I was just John, the quiet engineer, the dad who built that incredible treehouse. The kids, their fear of Carol long forgotten, spent their summer days in its sturdy embrace, their laughter the best testament to our victory. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the now peaceful neighborhood, I sat with Lily and Sam in the treehouse. We were looking at the stars begin to poke through the deepening twilight. The air was cool and smelled of freshly cut grass. "Dad," Sam said, his voice sleepy. "Remember that mean lady?" "I do," I said, putting my arm around him. "I'm glad she's gone," Lily added, leaning against my other side. "She didn't like our castle." I looked around at the solid wooden walls, at the steel bolts holding it all together. I had built it to be a fortress for them, a safe harbor in the storm of our grief. I never imagined I'd have to defend it so literally. But in doing so, I had not only protected this small piece of our family's new life, but I had also liberated an entire community. I realized the treehouse was more than just wood and screws. It was a monument to resilience. It was a testament to the fact that you can't let bullies, big or small, win. Sometimes, the only way to find peace is to be willing to fight for it, not with anger, but with patience, with intelligence, and with an unwavering belief in doing the right thing. I pulled my children close. "She's gone," I whispered, more to myself than to them. "And she's not coming back." The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of our old house. It was a peaceful, contented silence, filled with the gentle rustling of the oak leaves and the soft breathing of my children. We had found our new start. We were home.